The Pedalshift Project is sponsored by Hawbuck Dyneema Wallets. Leave the bulk at home and keep just the cash and cards you need in the super thin, ultralight wallet I carry on bike tours. Go to hawbuck.camp and get 10% off with offer code Pedalshift. Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. This month, we are going all the way back to episode number 13, episode 013, back in the day when I did the leading zeros. And this is going to be the beginning of essentially the series of the best ofs for 2019 are going to be revisiting as many episodes that have dropped off the feed as possible. So many of you have not listened to anything but the 100 most recent episodes. So we're going to make sure that we get some of the oldies but goodies out there. And this one is definitely one of my favorites. It was, I believe, my second or third interview that I had ever done. And this was with Gillian Willman. She was the producer and director of this really fascinating documentary called The New Woman, Annie Londonderry Kopchovsky. Now, Annie Londonderry, that was sort of her stage name, was one of the first women, or probably the first woman, to actually bicycle around the world. And we talk a little bit about what it was all about and the stagecraft behind it, as it were. But it was a real deal bike tour, and it was a real deal in the news of the day, which was basically back in the 1890s. And I think that the overlay that makes this an even more particularly fascinating story is the role that the bicycle had in essentially the liberation of women of the day. What women were, quote unquote, allowed to do back several generations ago stands in stark contrast to what women can do today. And I think that the fascinating element of it was the ability to travel was restricted in so many different ways back then. And the bicycle, particularly the safety bicycle, which is sort of the bike that we're used to seeing today, was a huge boon to women and freedom during that time of, well, society. So I hope you enjoy this. I do want to mention that this is a film that has done sort of the tour circuit, but as far as I can tell is not available for download or anything like that. If you do manage to find it, I've got a link in the show notes, and that's at pedalshift.net/013 to the trailer, which is worth watching, of course. But I would highly recommend trying to find a copy of this and definitely support it by purchasing it and streaming it if it's available. I could not find it. But the interview alone really is pretty fascinating, and Gillian really gives us a nice deep dive on what it was like in the time, the type of bike that Annie rode, and just all of the various layers of the onion that was Annie Londonderry. So here we go. Gillian, welcome to Pedalshift Project, and thanks for joining. This is such a fascinating story, and there's so much detail here. Can you start us off by giving a little bit of background on just how this all started, where a woman in her young 20s who just sort of rises out in the middle of nowhere in Boston to bike around the world? How did that happen?
Okay, so Thomas Stevens became the first man to ride a bike around the world in, I am blanking on the year, a few years before her. And allegedly, there was a wager among some wealthy Boston clubmen who said no woman would ever be able to do this. And one of the men said, well, I think a new woman would be able to do this. And they decided to make a wager. And allegedly, Annie Kopchovsky, was the woman who was elected to do this. And I'll explain later why I keep using the term allegedly, but the wager had various terms to it. She could not accept money along the way. She had to earn money in addition. She had to earn a certain amount of money by the end of the trip in addition to finishing it. And she had to earn enough money just to kind of get by on for lodging, for food. She couldn't accept handouts. There were ridiculous terms, like she couldn't accept marriage proposals, even though, of course, she was married, that she had to do everything on bike, which will come up later because she certainly took some shortcuts. And she started this ride in June of 1894. And from the moment she started, she told this story throughout. Every time she was questioned, she explained that she was doing this ride as part of a wager about the capabilities of women. And there is certainly some debate, and no evidence, frankly, either way, whether or not this wager really existed. There's nothing on paper. There's no other witnesses other than this story that she told over and over. It did have certain varieties to it, depending on the news article and the farther she got into her journey. So it almost doesn't matter whether or not there was a wager. She operated as though there was, and that's the story that the world got. So the bottom line is that this was a test of the modern woman, the new woman. Is this something that the new woman can set out by herself in a man's world and not just survive, but, exceed expectations and come out ahead?
It seems like during that era, the 1890s, that there was almost a meme, for lack of a better way of putting it, of gentlemen's bets to lead off to adventure. So that was a pretty common thing, bets to be the first person to go to the North Pole, bets to circle around the world by bike, things along those lines. That was something that was part of what the culture was during that time.
Absolutely. There were a lot of other people who were walking around the world, walking across America, crawling, ridiculous things. But it was, if you think about it, it's not unlike today with reality shows. And that's kind of, as I started working on my film, what I likened it to is that back then people had these wagers and they were highly publicized. So Nellie Bly and her trip around the world, which was part of a newspaper contest sort of, happened not long before Annie's trip. And Nellie Bly, who was a reporter for the New York World, was trying to beat the record of the character in Around the World in 80 days. And it was a mechanism, not just, I guess, for fun for her, but to sell papers. And so people were excited about her journey. They were kind of armchair adventures, and they would check in. They'd be able to read her dispatches from the various places she went and find out where she was, how she was doing, the suspense of was she going to make it. And for all these people who were hearing about these exotic parts of the world that they were surely never going to see, may not have ever heard of before, this was pretty exciting. And so it's not dissimilar to the silly, what I think are the silly reality shows, Survivor, and frankly, I don't watch them, but I know there are newer versions than that where people sit on their couches and watch other people try to win bets or win contests. It's just a very old traditional version of that. But people, I think, have always been drawn to watching someone else's semi-dangerous exploits and either rooting for them or rooting against them.
I never really thought about it from the perspective of the reality show, but that's totally true. It really fits that sort of modern feel in that way. There were tons of different layers to all this, of course. And, there was the athletic pursuit. There was this chauvinistic bet by two dudes in the middle of a pub in Boston. And, there was one other layer to it as well. And there were many others, but the promotional angle, there were sponsors, there was advertising. And Annie was amazingly skilled at making all of this happen. Talk a little bit about her incredible gifts in this area.
Yeah, well, the reason why when you hear about her in the few history places that she's started to be mentioned in now, they refer to her as Annie Londonderry. And as I said earlier, her name was Annie Kopchovsky. But before long, when she started her ride, she was known simply as Annie Londonderry. This is because her first sponsor was the Londonderry Lithia Water Company from New Hampshire. And when she started her ride on the steps of the Boston State House, according to newspaper accounts, she said that she needed to start raising her first pennies or dollars. And she started to raffle off different parts of her body, different parts of her bike. And she sold a space on her wheel for a placard for the Londonderry Bike Company. And so she carried this little placard that said Londonderry, and it was placed on her wheel. And shortly after that, within just a couple months, I would say, newspapers stopped calling her Annie Kopchovsky and started calling her Annie Londonderry, which is a pretty big transformation in the sense that Annie Kopchovsky sounds kind of like a Jewish immigrant. Annie Londonderry, yes, I guess that could be an Irish immigrant too, but it's more ambiguous. And it's Annie Londonderry, as we'll probably get more into, became a different person. She wasn't a Jewish immigrant, a mother tied down with 3 kids living in a loud, stinky tenement in Boston. She was this single, vibrant, international adventurer with really nothing holding her down. In terms of advertising, she, throughout her trip, sold other places on her body to local businesses as she rode through town. So she would sell ad space on her arm, her chest, her back, different parts of her body cost different amounts. And that is pretty innovative for back then. Right now, the idea of athletes having corporate sponsorship and selling, ad space on their spandex riding suits or whatever sport they happen to be playing, that's really normal and common, but it wasn't back then. And even if some other people were doing it, it's not like she saw them in, Inc. magazine and said like, oh, that seems like a good idea. It's very likely that she came up with this concept herself. And so it's really interesting how that was kind of a grassroots idea for her. And it's really how she was able to raise money along the way. And she did other kind of zany promotional things as well. She would go to different bike stores along the way and set herself up in their window or just in their shop and would give lectures about the benefits for ladies of riding bicycles. Or she would advertise the bike that she was riding on, which she started off on a Columbia and she ended up on a Sterling. She would hand out handbills, I guess, for local companies. She did this in a couple cities in France. So she really learned how to work, brand sponsorship when there was no precedent for it.
One of the ways to, I think, understand Annie a little bit better is to understand what the world was like around her. 1890s Boston in particular, but maybe even more so what it was like for a young woman like Annie during that age and how that impacted her and how that really created the woman that she was.
Sure. Well, Annie, as you mentioned, was at the time of her ride or shortly before, 23 years old, mother of 3, immigrant, working class. And for immigrant women and, most women in America, even for the upper class, the sphere was still supposed to be mostly all about the home. They were supposed to be completely dedicated to their family, to their husband. They were, supposed to take care of their children. Sometimes they worked when they absolutely had to, but they were not supposed to have dreams and ambitions of their own. They certainly traveled outside the home when they had to visit family, to do some, sorts of commerce. Whenever possible, they were chaperoned by a husband or male relative, especially younger women. And they weren't encouraged to walk, to have forms of exercise in the late Victorian phase, right around the turn of the century. And they were not encouraged to have their own forms of locomotion. They didn't walk, they didn't run, obviously they didn't have cars. But what struck me most about Annie's story is that she kind of broke the mold of everything that you would expect. She had these wild dreams and ambitions that did not fit into her, her Boston tenement with 3 young kids, and I'm imagining 3 young screaming kids and a very docile husband. She wanted to use this new technology, take this power under her feet and go explore her own dreams. And so, that's kind of a long answer, but she was not willing to play the role of the typical 1894 woman. She was definitely a new woman, which was what women were called at the time, who were kind of breaking out of this mold and having their own, sometimes, careers, dressing like men, exercising, and doing things that women were certainly not expected to do.
I want to touch on something you just mentioned about technology, because I think that it's important. You also mentioned this in the film as well, that this ride that she took was technologically not even probably possible until within a few years of that, with the advent of what we now know as the modern bike with chain technology, the safety bike. Can you talk a little bit more about how that change in technology really revolutionized things, not just to make Annie's ride possible, but for everyone in general, how that technology really changed things?
Yeah, so she started her ride in 1894, and if the ride had happened, or wouldn't have happened, but if the ride had come up as an opportunity a few years earlier, she would have had at her disposal a high wheel bike, which I don't know if your listeners are familiar with what these look like, but they have a giant front wheel and a small back wheel, and they are not easy to ride. You kind of have to hop on it and take a running jump. It takes a lot of athleticism, balance, and really can't be done in a long skirt. You would get your skirt caught and kill yourself. And so that was just out of the question. But the invention of what they call the safety bicycle, which is pretty similar to what bikes look like today, it was much easier for a woman to hop on, even with a long dress, and go for a ride. Obviously easier in pants than a dress, but they did have skirt guards on the sides, which kept long skirts from getting caught up in the spokes. And so that made a huge, huge difference. And at the time that Annie started her ride, biking was becoming much more popular among women. I mean, most women weren't riding around the bicycle, but it was becoming more common for women to bike as a leisure activity, or I guess as a short form of transportation from, one part of their neighborhood to another.
I was really fascinated both watching your film and doing additional research on the times how much the bicycle changed things for the women's movement, for the suffrage movement, the ability for women to have that extra degree of traveling freedom really made a huge impact in the lives of women of that time. And that was really striking to me, how important something that we, in a sense, sort of take for granted nowadays, the ability to travel like that, was really revolutionary with the bicycle back in the mid-1890s.
Yeah, and Annie knew that. And that's one of the incredible things to me about her kind of, not just media savvy, but just her savvy in general about what were the trends of her times, kind of being able to look at her times while she was in them and, say, people are starting to care about women's rights now. And if I kind of make this trip about the capabilities of women, people are going to pay attention to me. And I don't think she would have always labeled herself a feminist in the fact that she wasn't, marching alongside women fighting for the vote. As far as I know, she wasn't, actively involved. She was kind of out for her own self-promotion, but she knew that riding the coattails of the women's rights movement was going to be very advantageous to her success.
So as bike tourists, myself and the folks who listen to the show, we're totally fascinated by gear, at least to a certain extent. And Annie started off with a really heavy bike. She started off with a fixie and then ran into some problems and moved on to with a different bike and found that she had a lot more success with a lot lighter bike. Can you talk a little bit about her early struggles with the Columbia and then the success she found later on with the Sterling bike, the lighter bike?
Yes. So she started her bike on this Columbia, and she was allegedly sponsored by the Columbia Bicycle Company. So they gave us her bike. They gave her the bike. They had a representative from the company there to bid her farewell in Boston. And it was a 40-something pound bike, very heavy. And she was wearing long woolen skirts when she started the ride. So she had a lot of difficulty getting to Chicago. That was definitely the hardest part of her trip. She went south from Boston through Providence, Connecticut, through New York, ended up in Manhattan, spent a while there where I think she did a bit of refining of her riding costume. And then she followed the Erie Canal back through New York, Ohio, and went back to Chicago. But this took months, and it was in the heat of the summer. She was pretty miserable. She had a lot of difficulty with her long woolen skirts and heavy bike. And when she got to Chicago, she announced that she was going to quit, which was probably pretty devastating for her to have to admit defeat. So this was reported in all the papers, and she I think, tried to save face by announcing a new test for herself of how quickly she could get back to New York. But I mean, that was, a trifle compared to what she was supposed to have done. And then she spent some time in Chicago. No one knows exactly what she did during that time or what influenced her, but she, a couple weeks later, announced that the journey was back on and that she had been given a new bike by the Sterling Bicycle Company that was about 20 pounds lighter. And she had also traded her long skirts for bloomers. And the bloomers, which were kind of staple of what people then showed as the new woman in advertising or art, new women wore this bifurcated garment that many considered to be very risque because it showed that women had two legs, which you never would have known in this long woolen skirt. And it obviously made it much easier to do things that men did, like ride horses or bikes or just walk in general. And clearly she was not wearing corsets. So she was very unbridled in the views of many of the men of her time. So she was re-energized. She was ready to start her journey again in Chicago. Because she kind of quit, she now had to complete a circle of the globe from Chicago, which is why she ended her journey in Chicago and not in Boston. So rather than continue going the way that she was, which was westward across America, she knew by this time it was October, she wasn't going to make it before winter set in. So she decided to reverse her journey. But as she set out, for New York to embark across the Atlantic, she really set out as a new woman, much more confident. This was Annie Londonderry in her bloomers on her lighter Sterling, ready to totally reinvent herself and, in her mind, take over the world.
So Annie, in hindsight, makes a really smart decision in turning around, going through the Rocky Mountains in winter, and goes all the way back to New York, bikes all the way back to New York City, hops on a ship and ends up in France and has a very different experience in terms of her reception in France versus many parts of the US and other parts of the world as well. What is it about France and what is it about the juxtaposition of the different treatment that she received in all of these different places? Some places really were warm and receiving to the concept of a woman riding a bike around the world, and other people were sort of horrified by it. How do you think that speaks about the times that she was in?
Yeah, well, I think it just showed how different, depending on the societies, different societies, and even I think within each society, there were always sectors who were willing to accept the modern women or at least look at them from afar with respectful curiosity as opposed to scorn or disdain, because both attitudes certainly existed within France, as you mentioned. In Paris, she was kind of viewed as an oddity, and in some cases, kind of scorned. There was an article written about her, referring to this new woman as a third sex that's neither man nor woman, and that they didn't really know what to make of her. There were a lot of articles debating whether or not she should be considered pretty. She had a great reception, though, in Marseille. She was escorted all the way through France by mostly men of second clubs who joined her and came along to different parts of her journey. So she wasn't alone for that much in France. But she had large parties thrown in her honor where she would give lectures and raise some money. So she was really set it very well in France. As you mentioned, in some of the other, in Sri Lanka, in Singapore, there were, again, very different reports. There were some articles that talked about how disgraceful it was that a woman was outside the home doing this, dressed in the way that she was, that people should avert their eyes and kind of just let her pass. But in other places, she was, really invited as a symbol of modernity. And I mean, that attitude really existed, in both extremes everywhere, including all over America. It's just fascinating to read the press and all of the article excerpts that are in my film. Everything is from the research that Peter Zeitlin did for his book. He painstakingly went back through and resurrected her journey by contacting libraries around the world in the places that she might have passed through and collecting hundreds of newspaper articles that charted her journey. And so on any given day, you could read two different reports of this woman passing through, let's say El Paso, for example, and one person will talk about how wonderful it is and how she's a symbol of the new woman, and then someone else will talk about, young women, hide your eyes because she is exactly what you should not be. So it's really quite fascinating.
So as Annie traveled through Europe and through Asia, her trip got a lot more famous, and it spurned some criticism, particularly in part because she was not bicycling every last square inch of the ride. So she was, this one newspaper, I believe, mentioned traveling the world with a bike, not by bike. But maybe to a certain extent, a lot of the critics of the day were questioning really the truthfulness of a lot of the things that she was saying while she was on the ride. I'm just wondering how you see her kind of storytelling element of the ride and how you square that with the overall achievement, and whether or not that changes the concept of the entire trip, or if that's just one facet of the overall incredible journey.
So she went from France. She got on a steamer in Marseille, and she kind of hopscotched across the Middle East and Asia, ending up at the end in Yokohama. She did not ride a bike across Europe and Asia. She stopped in various ports and did little tours, bike tours in those places, probably not too far from where the port was, but she didn't cross the continents by any means. And then when she got to Yokohama, she took a steamer back to San Francisco. When she got back to San Francisco and in various places in the West on her return to Chicago, she gave lectures in sold-out lecture halls where people came to hear her talk about her journey. And she bought these lantern slides along the way that are kind of like what you and I would think of as postcards. There were these glass, sometimes beautifully hand-painted lantern slides, and she would buy them. You could buy them, I think, in various locations, and they would have postcards or lantern slides from other places that you didn't actually have to go to purchase. And she would project these and then tell stories about places she never went. So in these lectures that she gave in the Wild West, she told stories about tiger hunting in India, about getting shot as part of the Sino-Japanese War, which is really debatable that she ever would have had time to ride and be on the war front. But she told very detailed stories about how she was caught and taken prisoner, and someone next to her was shot by a bullet, and she saw, I think, a prison guard cut someone's heart out and eat it, and ridiculous, horrible things that probably never happened, but they made for great entertainment. They made for a great night entertainment for the people there, and they made for wonderful copy for the newspapers that were telling these stories later. And the farther she got into her trip, I mean, she wasn't telling me stories in the first few months of her journey, but by the time she left Chicago, she was telling tall tales. I mean, she wasn't talking about tiger hunting. She hadn't been anywhere near Asia yet, but she was already lying, saying things like she was single, for example. She didn't have kids, or she was a senator's daughter. So being very playful with the truth was always something that she did, but it really went to a new level when she gave these lectures and talked about exactly, I mean, as you said, she went around the world with a bike, not on a bike, but she certainly didn't tell that to her audiences. And when she did take a train back in America, she said, well, my wager, allows me to, it has stipulations that say I can do it from here to here. She made reasons for everything. To answer your second part of the question, how do I kind of square that with her accomplishments? To me, all of that is what makes her so fascinating. I remember when I first found out about the story, I found out about it from an article in Bicycling Magazine that was just a short version of Peter's book. He was still writing the book. And I called him and started asking him about Annie. And he said, well, I hope you're not disappointed, but she's really a very, flawed heroine. And started telling me about, more of her tall tales and some other pretty fascinating conclusions that he's drawn. And to me, that only made me more interested in the story. I mean, obviously nobody's perfect, and you have to be a certain kind of person to leave your children. Obviously, she was desperate to seek another life, but it just added a huge additional layer of fascination that this woman was able to to be such a storyteller. And I mean, who knows what else she had going on psychologically that she was so able to come up with these lies. But to me, it was all the more interesting. I mean, did she go around it took Thomas Stevens, I think, 2.5 or 3 years to actually cross continents on a bicycle. Clearly, she couldn't have done that in 15 months. But what she did was an athletic accomplishment in its own right. She rode mostly across America. She rode mostly through France. And that in itself was something that most or no women had done at that time. So an athletic accomplishment, it was still a big deal. But just as a human and female accomplishment, the fact that she came up with these lies, for me, doesn't detract from that in any way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the storytelling aspect of it is such a huge piece of it. It's an important piece of it, and it doesn't distract at all because, I mean, overall, it was an amazing achievement, even with some of the extras that she added on in there. So, in your film, you interview the granddaughter of Annie Kopchovsky, and she was one of the most interesting interviews of the entire film. And what I thought was most interesting about her was, on the one hand, she talks, very favorably about the legendary aspect of her grandmother, and yet at the same time, makes sure to mention that she kind of thought that maybe she was a bit of a lousy mother at the same time. I wonder what your point of view is on all of this. Why is Annie so fascinating? Her story isn't the pure heroine. She isn't the super mom. She sort of has a lot of warts, involved. We sort of like her, warts and all. What's sort of your point of view about Annie as sort of just the human being?
I think in many ways it's fascinating because she has warts. I mean, no one doesn't, but you also, hearing stories about lily white people in history, for me, aren't that interesting. Like, you want to hear about the people with the flaws, but I mean, there's a couple sides to it. One is, when you hear about Thomas Stevens, I don't know that much about him. I don't know what his family situation was, but if he had kids, no one talks about it. No one said Thomas Stevens left his wife and his 3 kids for 3 years to selfishly explore the world on a globe. I mean, the fact that that's even kind of the first thing that's mentioned about Annie shows a lot about expectations about men and women that really haven't changed since then. I mean, it would still be shocking if someone did that today. And frankly, when I first started working on the film, that was many years before I had kids of my own. Now I have one child, and I can't imagine leaving my one kid to go around the world for a year. I wouldn't want to do that. So I'm like, wow, she must have been pretty damn unhappy to have 3 little kids under the age of 5 and be okay with not seeing them and not doing FaceTime or phone calls or anything. So I think that says a lot about what she must have been pretty desperate in her life, that she was willing to leave her children. And, this is a dangerous journey, so she easily could never have come back. Right. To the point about Annie's granddaughter, she was a really interesting character because she had such respect and such amazing memories of Annie. But like you said, she recognized that she was not a good mother. There are some aspects of Annie's kind of afterlife after the ride that I wasn't really totally able to put in the film, just for length and other reasons. But so as I mentioned, she was Jewish. She had 3 kids, and after she came back from her trip, she had 1 more child. So 4 kids total. The 3 kids that were older, shortly after she came back from her trip, she and her husband moved from Boston to New York, and she sent those 3 older kids to boarding school. And she sent them to Catholic boarding school, which is kind of an odd choice for a Jewish family. And none of those 3 older kids ever married. They were all, I think, sort of troubled to different degrees in their life. And when one of them, a daughter, at the age of 18, announced that she wanted to become a nun, which, isn't a crazy result when you go to boarding school, Catholic boarding school, Annie disowned her and never talked to her again, ever. And she wasn't a devout Jew. I mean, she was somewhat observant. I think her husband was more devout than she was. But for someone who broke with tradition to such a dramatic degree that she did when she was 23, to disown her own daughter at the age of 18 because she wanted to have her own religious views, is really shocking. And she didn't speak to her for the rest of her life. Annie stayed married her whole life to Max. He was very, very devoted. Obviously more on the meek side. She was the bold one in the relationship. But yeah, he stayed with her after all of that. And she, as far as I know, never did anything quite like that again. She was always ahead of her time in different ways. She was a business owner. I think she was outspoken in her community for that. She did some journalism after she got back from her trip. She did some reporting for the New York World, and in some of the articles, her byline is either the New Woman or NBJ, which was short for Nellie Bly Jr. So she continued the persona a bit, but not much. And within, a few years or a year after taking this ride, her story was forgotten, because back then there was no internet archive. If you weren't in the daily papers, you were forgotten. And so Annie and her ride were completely lost to history until Peter started researching it in, 2002, maybe 2003.
Why do you think that is? I mean, we remember Nellie Bly and stories like that. Why is it that something so famous and so big that was so written about during the time sort of faded away into history until, just about the last 10 years or so?
Well, in terms of why it faded away, I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly, but I think there were probably lots of fascinating figures who, once they were no longer doing something and they weren't in the news anymore, there was no reason to remember them. Nellie Bly was 100% sponsored by the New York World, and she continued to do other important investigative journalism projects. And so I think she stayed around for a while because of that, and she's become a household name for people who, know women in journalism history. But the resurgence in Annie is really just a result of Peter's book. I mean, when I started working on the film, I worked on the film for like 8 years. And when I first started working on it, wasn't long after Peter started working on his manuscript. And other than me and Peter, no one knew or talked about Annie. Towards the end of when I finished my film, she was starting to be mentioned on the internet. By this point, Peter's book had come out, and so some people added her to lists of, on this day in history or Femilit or whatever, wherever you said you heard about Annie. Those kinds of things started to crop up. What was interesting is other people sort of towards the end of when I was working on my film heard about Annie, heard about my film or Peter's book, and started to kind of want to have their own creative offshoots. And a couple of them have been pretty successful. There's a play called Spin, which is by Evelyn Perry. She is a Canadian playwright, folk singer, actress, I guess you'd call her. And she's created this wonderful play, which is about the role of bicycles in the liberation of women. And it has a couple different vignettes of women in history, and one of them is Annie, and she uses bikes as instruments, musical instruments, and tells the story in a theatrical way of Annie's trip. So she's toured Canada. She's done a couple shows in America, I think, but mostly most of her shows have been in Canada. So there's that. Another woman has written a screenplay about Annie for a feature film, and she's trying to find the financing for that. I know somebody else was working on a children's book. And then in my film, the closing credits are this song that I discovered on the internet completely randomly. A girl, I think I was getting her master's, and her name was Anjima. Her name is Anjima, and she was writing a bicycle-inspired album as part of her master's in music. And she wrote this beautiful, incredible song, I thought, about Annie. And I heard it and I said, oh my God, I have to use this in my film somehow. So my composer was able to kind of redo the instrumentals, but keep her lyrics. And again, that was kind of all independently inspired by people who heard about Annie's story in the past 5 years or so and said, oh my God, how has she been lost to history, and how can I help do a teeny part to let more people know about her?
I'm so glad that you mentioned the song at the end of the film. It so reminds me of a Schoolhouse Rock song. It is so great. So hits the tone. I really loved it. I want to talk a little bit about the film. And before we started recording, you were talking about just sort of the direction that you're looking to have the film go into. It's been on the festival circuit a couple of years ago. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about how you view this in the frame of as an educational piece and other places where you think that this film, which is really, really excellent, and I'll gush about it some more, where you see it going in the future.
Well, thank you again for that. The film was in the festival circuit in 2013, and right now, most of what's going on in the film is kind of isolated screenings, people who contact me and want to show it at museums or visitor centers or as part of a small film festival or different events. But I would really love to do a lot more of that on a larger scale. I think the film is perfect for events having to do with Women's History Month or bike history, or having as part of a discussion in any sort of venue. I know there are a lot of bike cafes cropping up, women's cycling groups who have movie nights, things like that. So I think there's a pretty broad life in terms of institutions, clubs, cultural institutions as well, who I think could have some rich screenings of the film. And then I really hope that it can have some educational uses as well. I need to get educational DVD distribution. It's one of the many things on my to-do list. But I think that it would be a very valuable tool in classrooms, high school, maybe middle school, certainly college, where it could be part of lectures on many different topics, history in general, of course, but American history, women's history, sports history, advertising, Jewish history. There's so many different lenses that you could view her story from that it would be very relevant to sparking discussion on any number of topics. And since it's 26 minutes, it's really good to have in the classroom because you can watch the film and still have ample time to talk about the various issues that surround it.
And I definitely would encourage everyone listening to at least check out the trailer, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And check you out at spokeswomanproductions.com. And in addition to all that, in case anybody's listening in the educational realm and the film realm, again, total 5 stars. Talk a little bit more about how they can get in touch with you.
In addition to my website, my email address is on my website, but it's Gillian with a G at spokeswomanproductions.com. And we also have a Facebook page and Twitter, but I admit I'm not so active on Twitter.
And it's funny because the irony is that's exactly how I found out about you, because I do want to give a shout out to at Feminist Pics, because that's how I learned about Annie Londonderry. And then I walked down this great path and learned all about the story and then found you. And here we are. So just any other last things that you'd like to share with the listeners of Pedalshift Project about Annie and just all this amazing adventure and the amazing story behind her?
Well, I'm not sure I mentioned the kind of grand conclusion of her ride. I mean, I guess it a bit gives away the ending of the film. But
fair point.
Peter's, but I think it's interesting for those who will never see it. Peter sort of postulates that the wager never existed. Again, it's widely reported that it did, so it's quite possible that it did. But he thinks that Annie may have concocted the wager as this very elaborate scheme to escape the, life of domesticity that she was probably feeling suffocated by, and have this, this young woman have this liberated 15 months around the world where she could pretend that she was someone else, and did successfully. That, when he told me that kind of blew my mind, because you kind of take the wager at face value. You assume she's doing this, and even if the wager didn't exist, it still was a test of the capabilities of women. But the idea that somebody back then would have even thought to invent something like that and keep that lie up for that long and get so many people behind her is really extraordinary to me.
Yeah, I think I agree. But at the same time, it also speaks to Annie's strength of character and her taking the point of view that nothing was going to stand in the way of her adventure and her one real shot at it. And if it took her to make up a couple of chauvinists in a bar in Boston, well, hey, so be it.
Yeah, it's just brilliant.
Gillian, thank you once again so much for joining me today. It was really a pleasure. And for those of you listening, please feel free to check more out about Gillian and the new woman in the show notes. That's pedalshift.net/013. Gillian, thanks again.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, so right after we finished the recording right there, we started talking a little bit more about just some of the other aspects of the creation of the film and everything about it. And I have to share this one little piece that we talked about. Gillian did a ride after the fact in order to raise money for it. And I just wanted to share this little tidbit with you.
I did a ride from Boston to New York, tracing her route, and wore bloomers, kind of modern day bloomers. And one of the people who rode with us was 83 at the time. Now I'm forgetting, 73. This is terrible. But he rode on a high wheel the entire way. And it was really fun. At the beginning part of the filming, when we'd only done a couple interviews and needed money to do more interviews, and we started out in Boston and rode to New York. We took close to a week to do it. Obviously, it does not take that long if you're just going for speed, but we were being leisurely, intentionally, and we would try to do it in the spirit of Annie. So when we got into different towns, we'd like stop by the newspaper offices. That sounds so quaint now. It only worked once or twice, where you could just walk into a small town newspaper office and say, "Hey, we're here." And we'd kind of sent press packets out in advance, which is what she had too, saying, we'll be passing through and, hanging out in the local square, whether it was, we did this in Mystic, Connecticut, and New Haven, and various other cities as well. And we would stop in little town centers and sell T-shirts, and Gary would let people check out how his high wheel worked, and sometimes take a little microphone out and do Q&A and talk about Annie. So it was kind of like a little, dog and pony show in the various points on her journey from Boston to New York. But it was really fun. Obviously, we had all of the modern necessities that we needed that she didn't have, like bottled water and power bars and a car with all of our stuff and hotels.
Our first sponsor was a bottled water company, wasn't it?
That's true. And so I thought when I started the film, I'm like, this will be easy. I'll just get someone like Deer Park to give me $100,000. Obviously, I was really naive. That didn't happen. We did get a bunch of free tea from Honest Tea, though.
Oh, well, we love them. I'm just constantly fascinated by how talented she was at this. And anybody who's ever tried to raise money for, a cause or for a charity or for creating a film like you did, it's a lot of hard work. And it's just so amazing how truly gifted Annie was at raising money like that.
She was, and it seemed like she enjoyed it. I mean, I personally don't enjoy the fundraising process. I know most filmmakers, it's a necessary evil, but she was a natural at it for sure. She would have been very good at Kickstarter today.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.